Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. We start today's program in Sri Lanka, where the economy has collapsed, according to their prime minister. The debt-ridden nation has run out of money to pay for food and fuel. Protesters also stormed the president's house on Saturday, and President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has already agreed to resign on Wednesday. Faced with political turmoil and record-high inflation, what lies ahead for this island nation? Let's ask our panelists. For the latest Sri Lankan crisis, we are joined in Jaffna, Ahilan Kadagama, who is a political economist at the University of Jaffna. In Beijing, Zhou Rong, senior analyst from the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies with Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Professor, tell me more about how do you see the latest situation with the political turmoil is taking place in the capital city. How do you see the immediate prospect on the economic recovery, if there's any?
Yeah, now we've been in a very serious economic crisis, probably the worst economic crisis Sri Lanka is facing. And the last 6 months, the situation has been deteriorating considerably and very quickly. So this year, we are looking at possibly our economy shrinking from anywhere to 8 to 10%. So negative GDP growth of 8 to 10%. There is shortages of not only fuel, cooking gas, but even many food items. And in addition to that, there's been price hikes. So if you take fuel prices, it has more than tripled. The price of bread has more than tripled. Even locally produced rice, the staple, has also tripled. So we are looking at a very difficult situation for working people whose livelihoods and incomes are declining, but the cost of living is increasing along with shortages. So unless we address this crisis very soon, we might be even looking at a situation of famine in a few months. So it's a very serious situation, and it's to be seen whether the political changes can address this economic crisis.
Do you think it will or not?
People have lost confidence in definitely the ruling regime, but in parliament as a whole. So this people's movement that has brought about these dramatic changes have to impress on the parliament. We have to prioritize the imports that we bring into the country. We have to create a public distribution system or strengthen the public distribution system so that the state takes control of distributing these essential goods to the people. Yeah. And there has to be relief to the people.
But how much resources does the state still have?
In a situation like this, where we are going into an economic depression, the state would have to take forward deficit spending. It would have to borrow domestically, even if it's difficult for it to borrow internationally, and provide relief. And there also has to be a complete shift in our taxation policy. Amidst an economic crisis like this, it's very difficult to put further burdens on people through indirect taxes, such as the value-added tax on goods and services. They have to increase the taxes on the wealthy, and they might have to consider a wealth tax on accumulated wealth, because during a depression, everybody's incomes are collapsing, but there is accumulated wealth in the country which has to be redistributed, because unfortunately, over the last 4.5 decades, with the neoliberal economic policies in Sri Lanka, inequalities have dramatically increased.
How much outside help can Sri Lanka still have access to right now?
I think it's very hard to get outside help. One of the reasons is IMF just gave a very difficult condition for the loan. And some people say Sri Lanka, the problem has something to do with Chinese loan. It's really nonsense. Loan from China account for only about 10% of Sri Lanka total external debt. And in the past of the debt, profession loan account for more than 60% interest rate. its interest rate is only about 20%, and the repayment period is about 15 to 20 years. The remaining 40% of non-concessional loan provided by China account for only 20% of Sri Lankan total debt through such borrowing. The remaining 80% is borrowed from international capital market. I think it is IMF and some other international financial institutions the responsibility to lose their restriction on the loan to Sri Lanka. When we talk about Sri Lanka crisis, we have to mention about two external factors. Number one is COVID-19. The demand for Sri Lanka's tourism is declining. At the same time, because the conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
Professor Katagama, let me know about your thoughts on Mr. Zhou's comments.
I think Professor Zhou is correct in terms of there are very stringent conditions being put forward by the IMF. Their staff report that came out, that was made public in March this year, has already suggested many of the conditions that unfortunately the government has been implementing, increasing the burden on the people. For example, the report calls for market pricing energy. You're already seeing fuel prices now have tripled, which means farmers who use kerosene oil can't irrigate if those prices increase for kerosene oil. They haven't increased that. But even to plow their fields for tractors, they need diesel. Yeah. Fishing vessels need diesel. So all of this is affected by that kind of market pricing. They've asked for raising the taxes, and the indirect taxes have been increased, which affects all working people as opposed to focusing on income or wealth taxes that I mentioned. They're calling for austerity measures. Therefore, the government has stopped spending, even its programs, which means for seasonal workers, there's no construction work. All that has come to a stop. And they're also wanting state-owned enterprises to be profitable, but that's a euphemism for privatization. So yeah. IMF should not be imposing such hard conditions on Sri Lanka. In fact, it will be very counterproductive during a depression. If there's more austerity, that would only affect the country even more. Sri Lanka needs support from international actors. As you know, in the 1970s, and even for a long time, we've had a non-aligned policy, that to be non-aligned with all other actors, whether it is China, India, the Western countries, and we have to focus on a small country like Sri Lanka should not get involved in geopolitics. We should work with the international community on a neutral basis with all countries. And China has a long relationship with Sri Lanka. There was the rice rubber deal, even going back to the 1950s when we went through similar crises. In the 1970s, China built the famous public facility called the Bandaranaike Memorial International Center. Even today, that's one of the largest conference facilities in Sri Lanka. So we have this long relationship with China, but I think what is crucial is that Sri Lanka decides what kind of development we want. That is where Sri Lanka has been weak. We have always just got projects from abroad, and unless we decide on the kind of development that we want and the kind of development projects that we want to take forward, and we decide our path, and then we should ask international actors to support.
What are some of the most accessible help and support Sri Lanka could have, both from within and from outside? I think that would be a very crucial question for a country like Sri Lanka, and also for countries maybe of similar size that are likely to experiencing some quite challenges over the next few years when the world's economy are going really bad. Professor.
True. And Sri Lanka, I think, is a case that we're going to see happen in many other countries around the world, this kind of a debt and default and the same challenges. Also because global conditions are very negative right now. Even the United States is going into a recession. Therefore, interest rates They have been raising the interest rates there. So the cost of capital for countries like Sri Lanka is going to become even more difficult. The war in Ukraine has increased everything from the prices of not only oil, but also fertilizers, of wheat, a lot of the essential inputs that we need to keep an economy going. In this context, we have to reset our priorities. In terms of Sri Lanka, the food system is our priority, because if you can't feed your people, then there's no point talking about economic growth. And we need credit lines to be able to stabilize the economy.
Professor, one of the earlier problems that Sri Lanka had experienced is the use, or rather the abandoning of some fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. Of course, things later changed, but it laid the groundwork for the current problem. So, Professor, now are things really getting better? What exactly, to what extent do you think a change will happen in terms of protecting the agriculture of your country?
Yeah, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's overnight policy of banning chemical fertilizers was disastrous. It has greatly reduced agricultural production, and farmers have really suffered. So with that season and the losses, they still haven't recovered. So farmers have lost confidence in producing. So this has been a very disastrous move. We need to start the process of rebuilding everything from addressing agriculture to the kind of industrial policy that we need in the interests of the majority of the people, the working people who create the wealth for this country. This country has been ruled by a very small elite who have been only concerned about their own self-interest. And now there's a great awakening going on in Sri Lanka. So it's also a hopeful moment amidst this very difficult situation of an economic crisis.
Now, Mr. Joe, I do want to ask you about the same question I asked Professor Katagama, that is, under the current geopolitical and the global economic circumstances, how much bargaining power a country like Sri Lanka has?
For bargaining power, Sri Lanka is right now is still limited. My proposal is right now, one have a negotiation with an international financial institution. Another thing is more important is what we say, try to do their best to address the urgent issues, such as food shortage and others. Get more humanitarian aid rather than official international aid. I don't really think there's an immediate solution for all kind of problem of a crisis. But anyway, we can relax certain kind of situation, make the people can make a little bit better living.
I want to, on that note, thank both of you for joining us, Mr. Lankan Katagama and also Joe Rong. Really appreciate it. Thank you.